Okay, welcome to part 4 of the shoot 'em tutorial. At this point you should have a couple of player characters moving around and a little nav title screen, and they should be able to shoot, if I can remember what the keys were. But they don't hit each other yet, and that's what we're going to do. So what we're going to create is we're going to create damage to the players, and we're going to change the scoring. Okay, so that's what we're going to start. Now, in order to do this, the bullet needs to detect a collision with the player, and when it gets that, it's going to communicate a message to anyone who's interested, saying that a particular player number has been hit. Okay, and in order to do that, we have to define a message type. So if you look in the folder, setup and storage, there is a file in there called extra message type. So if you just double click that, I'll just open that up a little bit, and you'll see that there's some predefined ones here, and you just do them all in the same way. They're just a name really that we can refer to. So we're going to create one for player hit. So I'm just going to copy and paste that last one. So let's just zoom that in a little bit, and I'm just going to rename it to player hit. Okay, so that's a message type, and we'll get on to using that in a little while. Okay, so that's just a pre-prep. You can create as many message types as you want. If you don't want some of these messages, you can delete them. They're just from when I've been messing about with things, testing stuff. Okay. Right, we're going to start with the bullet sprite, and we're going to look at the constructor, and we're going to set up the extra bits of work that is going to allow us to do collision detection. Okay, so at the bottom of the constructor, so after I've set my viewport code, what I'm going to do, first thing, I'm going to say collision active equals true. This makes this sprite now part of the collision system of the engine. And because I want the bullet to handle the collisions, I'm going to make it collision primary as well. So I'm going to say collision primary equals true. And that tells the engine that it's the bullet that's checking for collisions with other things. Okay. What that allows me to then do is to use an epilogue. Now this is a routine that when collision detection is done, at the end, which is what an epilogue is, it will call our method, which we're going to call, I don't know, hit something. But we might add extra things in the future. Okay, so this is another method, so it's a little bit like that on update. You can have multiple things run, so we're just going to generate that method. And you'll see that when it creates that, it's got two parameters this. So we can, the engine, what it does is that when it finds a collision, it will run our hit something method, and it will pass to us the primary sprite, which is collision owner, and the sprite that was hit. And then, because you might have lots of different things that you want to do when you hit different sprites. Okay. Right, so what we need to do is then just set up a little bit of code now to say, right, what we want to do. And in general, and this is general, you might not do this. What we'll do is we'll check what type of sprite we've hit. Okay, so we'll build a switch statement, and we'll put a case in, and we'll say, okay, if collided with dot type is T player, so we hit a player sprite, then we'll deal with that situation. That's all we've got at the minute. So the first thing that we're probably going to want to do is get rid of the bullet. So we're going to say this dot kill. Remember, this refers to the object that we're dealing with. So we're dealing with a bullet. So we're saying kill the bullet, get rid of the bullet, take it off screen. Now, our player characters are not sprites, they're actors. So what we've got to do is we've got to cast. So we're just going to say actor P, and then it looks horrible, but what we're saying is we know something about this sprite object. We know it's actually an actor. So what we're going to do is we're going to say, right, let's treat it as an actor. And the reason we do that is that gives us access to the fields and methods that are public for that actor. Because I want to know what the player number is. And that isn't anything to do with the sprite, but it is something to do with an actor. If you just refresh by going back to actor, you see that we've got this thing, public player num. I want to check that. And I'll explain why in a sec. Right. As I'm building this switch, it's moaning and saying that I've got an error. I can't fall through. So let's just put a break. And what a break does is it marks the end of the case statement. Okay, so it's like, oh, that's the end of checking and doing the actions if it was T player. All right, so just put that at the bottom. Right, so we know we've hit a actor. Now, we don't really want to shoot ourselves. Okay, now when we created a bullet, we passed the player and we stored it in boss. So we can look at that and we can say if boss dot player num is not equal to p dot player num, then that's not us effectively. Say if the boss's player number isn't the same as this player number, then that isn't us. Fine, we do want to actually do some damage to this character. Okay. Now all we're going to do now, we don't want the bullet being in control of what happens when a player gets hit, because that's not what a bullet should just be about a bullet. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a message and we're going to broadcast that message. And then anybody who's interested in those types of messages to say that a player's been hit, they will deal with what they need to do if a player's been hit. Okay, so this is quite a simple process. We'll just create a simple short throwaway variable. We'll call it M. It's a type message, and we'll just say new message. Okay, right, we want to pass a type, so we're going to say type, and this is where that extra message that we just created comes in. So we say extra message types, and we're going to say player hit. So we're going to announce in this broadcast that some player's been hit. We need to say what player it was. So in message, there are various fields that we can set. There's one that's got an integer value. And in there, we're going to put the player number that's just been hit. Okay. Right, so that sets the message up. We then need to broadcast it. So we're going to use the message bus system. And we say dot instance, and then we just say broadcast message. And the message we want to broadcast is M, the one that we just created. And that's it. That's all the collision code that we need to put in for the bullet. Okay. So let's just summarize what we did. So we set the bullet to be collision active and collision primary because it's going to be in charge. We set up an epilogue, okay, so that when the collision is detected, our code gets run. In this epilogue, which we called hit something, we look to see what type of sprite it was. If it's a player sprite, we kill the bullet. If it isn't a player sprite, we don't do anything, okay? But we kill the bullet. We say, okay, we know what we've collided with is an actor, so let's cast collided with to actor and call it P for simplicity's sake. And then we just check to make sure we haven't shot ourselves. And if we haven't shot ourselves, we then broadcast a message saying this player has been shot. Okay. Right. The next thing we're going to do is we want to, every time someone gets shot, we want to increase the score for the other player. So we're going to go to game container and I'll show you how you now subscribe to messages. So let's zoom that in a little bit. In game container, in the constructor, what we're going to do is we're going to add a subscription to the player hit messages. So we're going to say message bus dot instance dot subscribe, and there are various ways in which you subscribe, but we're going to use the simple one, which is just to say what type and what method is going to handle the messages when they come. So we want extra messages dot player hit, and it remembered we used that last. And then we'll just call this handle scoring because that's what it's going to do. That doesn't exist, so we'll get Visual Studio to create that by right clicking and saying generate method stub, get rid of the exception. And all we're going to do is we're just going to say, right, well, if when we look at the message, it was player 1 that got hit, we're going to add score on for player 2. Okay, so we're just going to do a switch. So we can see that we've been given a parameter for the message. So we can say message dot int value, because that had the player number in it. And we're going to say case, well, if it was a 1, let's put break in. And the other case was if it was 2. So if you put the breaks in, that's good practice when you're doing switches. So if player 1 has been hit, then that must be a score for player 2. So we're going to say score P2 plus plus. Remember, that's short for saying add 1. And if player 2's been hit, we're going to increase the score for player 1. Oh, score plus plus. Okay, and that's all we need to do, and that's the scoring. The nice thing about passing messages is with game container doesn't need to know anything about a bullet, and a bullet doesn't need to know anything about the game container. So it keeps it nice and logical. Okay, when you're creating objects, you're trying to make sure that they're not dependent on knowing information that they really shouldn't be concerned with. Okay, so the message passing is a good way to do that. It isn't necessarily the most efficient way of doing it, but it keeps the solution tidy. Okay, right. None of this is going to work unless we set the actor up to be part of collision handling. So let's go to actor. See, there wasn't much in game container to do, was it? All right, let's go to actor. So in the constructor, what we need to do, 2 things. We need to make sure that we set the type. So we say type is gm.tPlayer. So we can look for that later on. And we also need to make sure it's collision active. So I'm just putting this at the bottom of the constructor. So I'm saying collision active equals true. Okay. The only other thing that we need to do is when an actor's been hit, that message is getting broadcast by the bullet, we need to subscribe to it as well. So we're just going to do exactly the same thing as we did with the game container. If I could type it a bit better. We're just going to, oh dear. He says instance.subscribe again, and we're just going to say extra message types, and we're going to have player hit, and what should we call this one? Let's just call it hit. So whenever we receive a message is broadcast, this method called hit will be run. Okay. So I've just right clicked, said generate method stub to create that. So I'm going to delete that, and then we're just going to put the code in. Now, what we'll try and do is when we get hit, 2 things you can do. You can reset the position of a sprite. Well, I don't want to do that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to make the sprite invincible. Okay. So just at the end of the constructor, in order to help visualize this, we're going to initialize the timer system. Okay, we'll just do that once. And what the timer system will allow us to do is to do flashing. So flash the sprite on and off. So when we get hit, we'll turn flashing on. Okay. So we just got to write this little bit of code. Now, when a message is broadcast by a bullet, we don't know whether it's us that have been hit. So we need to see if we're the ones that have been hit. So if we do an if in hit and say, is the message int value equal to my player number? Okay, now to make that a bit more clear, I could say this dot player number. If that's true, unfortunately, we've been hit. So what we'll do is we'll turn collisions off. So we'll say collision active equals false, and that's the easy way of turning collisions off. We'll then turn the flashing on. So we'll say timer.flash continuous. Now, whenever you're flashing, it looks nicer if a sprite is visible longer than it's off. Okay, so the on duration I'm going to set to 0.06f, so 600ths of a second, and then I'm going to make it invisible for 400ths of a second. We put the f to mean a float value. Okay, if you don't put an f, it assumes it's a double precision value, and you'll get an error, and it'll say something about you can't convert. Yeah, it has some invalid arguments because flash continuous wants 2 floats. Okay, so that'll make it flash. What we want to do then is, after a little bit of time, we want to turn collisions back on and turn the flashing off. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a one-off event using the event manager. So we say gm.eventManager delay call, and then we decide how many seconds. So let's say you're invulnerable for 3 seconds, and then we're going to run a method, or we're going to call a method called make vulnerable. You can have a better name if you want. Okay, we get an error because that dot exists, so we're just going to generate that. Generate method stub. Okay, and all this needs to do is turn the collisions back on and turn the flashing off. So if we just say collision active equals true, and then we just say timer dot off, and then in brackets we have a parameter called true. Now what this does is it makes sure that the sprite is visible, because if we were flashing, we might be turning it off while it's not visible, and then you won't see the sprite. So that overrides any visibility setting. Okay, theoretically that's it. So let's just summarize what we've done. We created a message type to say a player's been hit. In the bullet, we set up collision detection, and we put the bullet in charge of collision detection. So we created an epilogue that checks to see what type of sprite it's hit, and that's the player one. It then kills the bullet, checks to see if it isn't the owner's bullet. If it isn't, it broadcasts a message saying what player number's been hit. In the game container, we subscribed to that message, and we said, right, okay, whenever we get one of those messages, run the handle scoring code, and that will increase the scores. We were already displaying the scores, remember, because we did that before. In the actor, just did a couple of things. Turned collision on for the actor, set its type up properly, subscribed to the player hit message, turned the timer system on, and then in the player hit subscription method, which we called hit, we just say, right, well, did I get it? If I did, let's make myself invincible for 3 seconds and flash. And then after those 3 seconds are up, we run make vulnerable, and we turn collisions back on. Right, so theoretically we can run this. Let's see if I've got this right. So run our title screen. Alright, I am just going to rotate and shoot. He says, remember it's jerking because the camera's jerking. I always find this difficult when I'm playing the games. Right, there he goes, he flashes. And you can see the player 2 score went, oh, I got him again. But those are going straight through because he's invincible. Oh, just missed. Oh, gold. Go on. Oh yeah, got him. Oh, you think it's a bit tight, but it's just the way the collision detection is working. I will explain in a later video why that did that. But it's loose, and it's as loose as we want it to be. We can do extra checks and things to make collision detection more. Okay, so we've got a system now where we can shoot each other in the face, which is what I promised. Okay, but the game will never end unless you press escape. Okay, so in the next part, we're going to work out how to detect that the game's won. So we'll play up to 10, but we'll do that in the next part. Okay, thank you very much.